In a small, quiet town nestled in the hills of the American West, the world seemed to move slower, and every person had their role. Life was tough here, with harsh winters and long, dry summers. Families were the backbone of this town, and each one was expected to carry its weight, especially when it came to raising children. Children were seen as a blessing, a future, and a legacy. Without children, a family was considered incomplete. In this town lived a woman named Eliza Montgomery. She wasn't born here. She had come as a young girl after her family moved west seeking a new life. Her family had hoped to make a fortune, but that never happened. They settled into the rhythm of town life, and as Eliza grew older, she too dreamed of starting a family of her own. But there was one thing Eliza couldn't do. She couldn't have children. At first, Eliza didn't think much of it. She was content with her life. She had a good family, friends who admired her, and a quiet peace that many people in the busy world might envy. But in a town where women's worth was tied to the number of children they had, Eliza's story became something else. People started whispering behind her back, and it wasn't long before she felt the sting of their words. When she married John Montgomery, a local farmer, people assumed that their family would soon grow. John was a hard-working man, known for his strength and kind nature. They had known each other since childhood, and their bond had always been strong. But after a few years of marriage, something became clear. Eliza couldn't have children. At first, John didn't care. He loved Eliza for who she was, not for what she could give him. But over time, the pressure from the town began to weigh on him. His friends, his neighbors, even strangers in the marketplace would ask him when he planned to have children. The looks he received when he walked into town holding his wife's hand began to feel more like pity than respect. John didn't know how to fix it, and he wasn't sure how long his love for Eliza would be enough to carry them through the judgment they faced. As the years went by, Eliza began to notice the change in the way people looked at her. She had always been a quiet, reserved woman, but now she felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her. It wasn't just that people whispered when she walked by. It was that people avoided her. Mothers with children would glance away when they saw her, as though her presence was a reminder of what they had that she didn't. Women would talk to her, but there was always a coldness in their tone, a barrier between them. It felt like a silent reminder of her failure to meet the town's expectations. The worst of it came from the town's women, who had their own ideas about what a woman's life should be. They saw motherhood as the highest calling, the greatest achievement a woman could have. And if a woman could not have children, she was often looked at with suspicion. Eliza tried to ignore their comments, but they found their way to her heart, each one a tiny cut that left her feeling more alone and unwanted. John tried to comfort her, telling her over and over that it didn't matter, that they had each other and that was enough. But Eliza knew it wasn't enough for the town. The more she heard their whispers, the more she felt her heart break. It wasn't long before she started to believe that maybe John was the only one who didn't see her as less than everyone else. She started to wonder if maybe she was, after all, the problem. Despite John's love and support, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed in some way. She went to bed each night wondering if there was something she could have done differently, something she could have tried to fix. Maybe if she had tried harder, maybe if she had been stronger, she could have given John the family the town expected them to have. Then one summer, Eliza fell ill. It started with a fever, something that seemed harmless at first. John cared for her as best as he could, but she didn't improve. Days passed and her fever only worsened. John sent for the local doctor, but the medicine and treatments did little to help. Eliza grew weaker, and soon the life she had known began to slip away. The town rallied together, as they often did when someone was in need, but there was little they could do. People began to visit the Montgomery home, offering food and prayers, but no one really knew how to help. Eliza's illness took its toll, and after a long, painful week, she passed away in the small, dark bedroom of their home. Her death was a shock to everyone, but in the strange way that life goes on in small towns, there were no tears, no deep grief from the community. It was as if her life hadn't been significant enough to warrant much mourning. John, devastated by the loss of his wife, was left to carry the weight of his grief alone. He knew the town's judgment would never cease. They would never let him forget that he had married a woman who could not give him children. But what happened next was something that John never could have imagined. In a decision that would haunt him for years to come, the town's leaders, influenced by some of the more powerful voices in the community, decided that Eliza's death would not be mourned with a traditional ceremony. Instead, they made a decision that would shape the rest of her story in ways no one could have foreseen. The town, for reasons that no one quite understood, decided that because Eliza had not fulfilled her role as a mother, she would not be treated with the dignity most people received after death. It wasn't enough that she had been loved by her husband or that she had been a kind, caring woman. What mattered was that she had failed to give birth to children. And so, without any ceremony or real respect, Eliza's body was quickly prepared for burial. The decision was made, and within hours of her passing, the town's officials had arranged for her to be buried in the cemetery outside of town. The burial was rushed, a hurried affair that no one in town would ever speak of openly. Her body was lowered into the earth, not with the loving care that most people expected, but with the coldness that would remain with the town long after her grave had been covered. It was as though the town had decided in their own way that she had no right to be remembered. The lack of ceremony, the lack of respect, made it clear that in their eyes Eliza had lived and died without fulfilling her true purpose in life. But even in death, Eliza's story was far from over. This part introduces Eliza's struggles and the harsh reality she faces in a small, judgmental town. Her inability to have children becomes the center of the town's treatment of her, and her death is marked by a lack of respect. This creates a strong sense of injustice, which will set the stage for the cowboys' later actions in Part 2. Hank Williams had always been a man who kept to himself. He wasn't the type to make a lot of noise or draw attention to his actions. A tall, weathered cowboy with hands rough from years of hard work, Hank lived alone on a piece of land on the edge of town. The land was far from luxurious. A small, modest ranch where he kept a few cattle, and a stable where his horse, Rusty, often roamed freely. Hank had lived there ever since his wife, Maggie, had passed away some years ago, leaving him to face the solitude of life without her. Hank and Maggie had been happy together. They had no children, but they didn't need them. Their love for each other had been enough. They spent their days working the land and caring for each other, and when Maggie died, it felt like a part of Hank had died with her. Life for him became quieter. He would visit town for supplies, but he avoided social gatherings. The memories of Maggie were too fresh, and the pitying looks from people who knew he was a widower were more than he could bear. But on one evening, when the sky was painted with hues of orange and purple, Hank rode into town. He needed to pick up some supplies for the coming winter. As he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, he overheard a conversation that caught his attention. The voices came from a group of men sitting on the porch of the saloon, talking about the recent death of Eliza Montgomery. Hank had heard of Eliza, of course. Everyone in town had. He had never spoken to her, but he had seen her from time to time, always walking with a quiet grace, always with her head held a little higher than most. There had been talk over the years about her inability to have children, but Hank had never given it much thought. He believed in people, not in the judgments others passed on them, but as he listened, something in the conversation made his blood run cold. The men were speaking casually about the burial, mocking the quick and disrespectful way in which Eliza had been laid to rest. They laughed about how no ceremony was needed for a woman who never gave her husband children, and how her death was hardly a loss to the community. The words hit Hank like a slap to the face. He had known pain, loss, and loneliness, but he had never known this kind of cruelty, not even when Maggie had passed. The thought that people could treat another human being with such callousness, even after death, stirred something deep within him. Hank couldn't stand it. He didn't know why, but in that moment something in him snapped. Without a second thought, he walked into the saloon, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He ordered a drink but kept his mind focused. After a few moments, he paid the bartender and stepped back out into the cool evening air. His heart was racing, but he knew what he had to do. Hank had always been a man of action. When he made a decision, he followed through. It was how he had gotten through the tough years after Maggie's death, through hard work and determination. And now, it was how he would handle this injustice. He turned back toward the outskirts of town and rode to his ranch to gather a shovel, a lantern, and a blanket. He didn't think twice about it. He knew what he had to do. The town had buried Eliza in the cemetery on the edge of town, and it was there that Hank's mission began. He wasn't going to let her be forgotten. It was a moonless night, and the darkness wrapped around Hank like a thick cloak. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the distant hoot of an owl. His horse, Rusty, trotted steadily as Hank's mind raced with thoughts of Eliza. The injustice of it all gnawed at him. She had been a person, not a symbol of failure, and she deserved more than the town had given her. When Hank reached the cemetery, he dismounted and looked around. The town was asleep, unaware of what he was about to do. He felt the weight of the shovel in his hand as he dug into the soft earth. The task was harder than he had expected, but Hank didn't mind. With each shovelful of dirt he removed, he felt a sense of purpose wash over him. It was like he was digging not just for Eliza, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, everyone who had been judged without mercy. Hours passed, and Hank's muscles ached. But he didn't stop. The grave, shallow and hastily dug, finally gave way to the body beneath. There, wrapped in a simple cloth, lay Eliza Montgomery. The sight of her, pale and lifeless, but still a woman, still a human being, filled Hank with a quiet sadness. He had never known her, but in that moment he felt as though he did. He carefully lifted her body, cradling her gently as if she were fragile. His heart swelled with a deep, unspoken promise. He wasn't just rescuing her from the earth. He was giving her the dignity she had been denied in life. With slow, careful movements, he wrapped her in the blanket he had brought, securing her gently as he placed her across the saddle of his horse. The journey back to his ranch was solemn. Hank didn't speak a word, but in the silence he could feel the weight of what he had done. He had defied the town. But more importantly, he had defied their cruelty. He had shown Eliza, in his own way, that she was worth something. She deserved a proper resting place. She deserved respect. When Hank arrived at his ranch, he walked Eliza's body to a quiet corner of his land. It was a peaceful spot, shaded by an old oak tree far from the judgmental eyes of the town. He dug a new grave, deeper and more respectful than the one she had been hastily buried in. When he lowered her into the earth, it felt right. The land beneath his feet was quiet, as if it too were honoring her. Hank stood by the grave for a long time, staring down at the simple mound of earth that now marked the final resting place of Eliza Montgomery. He didn't need a fancy headstone or grand ceremony. What mattered was that she was now where she belonged, treated with the dignity she deserved. He placed a simple wooden cross at the head of her grave, and in his heart he whispered a prayer, not just for Eliza, but for all those who had been treated unfairly, who had been judged without mercy. The news of Hank's actions spread through the town quickly. At first people were shocked. Some were angry, others confused, but slowly the community began to change. They began to see Eliza not as a woman who had failed, but as someone who had been wronged. They started to question their own assumptions and judgments. Hank's quiet, solitary act of compassion had opened their eyes to the truth that no one should ever be defined by something as shallow as the ability to have children. Though Hank would never seek praise or recognition, he had done something more important than any grand gesture. He had changed hearts. In the end, that was what mattered most.